Yeah, it's on the base of the microphone.
Okay, there we go. Okay, first of all, I want to appreciate you guys for taking the time out of your busy schedules to interview me for the commissioner position this morning. I know you guys are busy. I was born and raised in northern Arizona. I've been enjoying the woods ever since I was a child. Growing up, our family time was normally spent out hunting, and I appreciated every moment of it. I still spend my free time out in nature, and I'm instilling the same appreciation in the outdoors in my children. Being born and raised in a family business at the Grand Canyon, I have worked all aspects of our company, ranging from daily operations to overall management. We currently operate 9 companies and manage over 80 employees. I started my firefighting career as an EMT as a candidate, eventually becoming the fire chief and the president of the board. During the 14 years, some of my responsibilities included field operations, running meetings, develop safety programs, and standard operating procedures, directing wildland fires to promote grazing for ranchers, as well as many other tasks. In this career, I've learned how vital volunteers were in the department and how crucial it was to reach out to the public. I also had to distinguish between being the fire chief and being president of the board. For example, being as chief, I knew there were necessary items that needed to be purchased. But as president, I knew such items required funds that were allocated for more pertinent necessities at the time. During this career, I worked with a program called WEFAC. It's an organization between Northern Arizona Fire Chiefs, the United States Forest Service, and the Arizona State Forester. In this organization, we ensured interagency cooperation and training programs. I've been a regular attendant of foundations such as the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, National Turkey Federation, the Arizona Mule Deer Association, and through the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, I learned about the North American conservation model and how conservation has positively affected our wildlife. That was my opening.
Okay, thank you. We'll start the questioning with Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Collins, I want to thank you for your interest in this position and speaking with us today. Will you please tell us what you believe to be the 2 most important issues that will face the Arizona Game and Fish Department in the next 2 years?
I believe in the next 2 years, our biggest controversies that we've had recently were such as like the trophy hunting. Through a lot of that, I believe is lack of education to the public. I believe that we need to push more educational programs, let them know where our funds come. A lot of people, even hunters, believe that a lot of money comes from general funds for the game and fish. I believe education can be a big problem. We need to reach out through social media. It seems people get more education off of Twitter and Facebook and items like that. So we kind of got to reach out to the younger youth there and educate them, let them understand how the game and fish operates, why what we do, etc. The other thing I see as a big problem is water. Up where I'm at in northern Arizona, our family business, we actually have 2 wells that are 3,400 feet deep. And a lot of that is, you go out in the forest, during the early springs, there's a lot of drought times, and water's a problem up where we're at too, but funding and that goes along with it. But I believe education is probably the #1 thing we should concentrate on as commissioners and try to push the public and get them to understand, a little more of what we do. Also, out that I see is money is always a problem with game and fish, and reaching out to the resources to attain that money. I believe other programs need to be put in place to try to raise money for that, other than putting pressure on the wildlife.
Thank you. I have no further follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Collins. Okay, we appreciate it. As you're probably well aware, we have an expanding urban and suburban use of land in Arizona. And that expansion reaches right up to areas that were considered recreational and were open to hunting. We have a diminishing number of agricultural producers who maintain agriculture as the prime use of the lands that are out there, and they also enhance the habitat for the wildlife. What do you see as a productive role in keeping access to recreational lands by keeping the agricultural community happy with the multiple uses of recreation that as they coincide with trying to make a living in agriculture? What do you recommend be done to make sure that this relationship between the landowners and the sportsmen continue to be productive for both?
I'm actually very familiar with this. Growing up in northern Arizona, I'm actually about 20 miles from the south rim of the Grand Canyon, so I grew up on the Boquillas Ranch. I've seen a lot of the ranchers sell out to subdivisions, and then you end up with a lot of property that is lost due to that. And also I've seen both sides of it. I've actually sat down with Miss Sherry Blair. She was pretty much my adopted grandma. She adopted me. She had a 115,000 acre ranch. And it was all locked up. They wouldn't allow anybody in there. Even when I was out hunting out there, they wouldn't want anybody in the vehicle knowing their ranch. I asked her one day, I said, why are you so apprehensive to allowing people out on your ranch? And prior to that, they did let people out there and they left gates open. It would take 2 weeks to separate their cows from the neighbors. For me, if I was in the rancher's shoes, I would be answering a little on the guard of not allowing the public out there. So you got to almost kind of make it worth their while to do so. And Unit 10, you're probably aware, between Boquillas and all the large ranches out there, a lot of the access is not allowed. I believe if you look at other state models, such as New Mexico, the landowner tags incentives to pay back the rancher in a way. For example, I hauled water out there to a tank that was empty. I got 200 yards away and there was 90 head of elk that come running down to that drinker. There goes the 2,000 gallons of water they just paid for. And when wells are 3,400 feet deep, they're paying 2 to 5 cents a gallon. So on top of that, with the public leaving gates down, trash, dirt, it's going to be a juggling act. And I believe the only way to do that is follow other states' models, such as the landowner programs that encourages them to open their ranch up to the public and give them a monetary compensation, not out of Game and Fish's pocket per se. In New Mexico, they sell the vouchers and they still have to buy the tag. It is targeting more of a wealthy group to do so, but in the meantime, it pursues them to want to better the habitat, to get more tags, and to allow the public onto the ranch. I believe maybe leading toward more of the state structure, trying to get the state department through legislation to allow more access to state lands that are being ranched and grazed might be an approach, but that is a difficult question to have a rancher open up their home being essential to the public and allow them to have their way there. We're rural, very rural. We got one officer patrolling hundreds of square miles, so it's up to the individual landowner to kind of regulate. And I'm familiar with the Parent Ranch. I do trap out on the Parent Ranch in the wintertime and help Mike McCauley out with predators. And I've seen the battle between the land stewardship, where they have the roads closures. And a lot of the public won't follow that, even though they're trying to get along with the Game and Fish program. There's still a lot of violations on the roads, and so it is a handful for the ranch owner to allow the public onto their ranch. I don't want to see them close the ranches off, but I believe through, like I said, other state programs and models, we might be able to adopt what would fit our state.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. You do raise a follow-up question. First, I appreciate hearing about your incentives ideas. I see you're a libertarian on the list that you have, and how does that comport with having the state force open access?
I'm not getting your question on that.
That's my question. You mentioned having state legislation that would require land, that is the ranchers or the other agricultural producers to open access.
Actually, it's applying towards the state land department, the state trust land. That's more in a public interest. I know it's all held by trustees, and they have the rules. Our problem we have out there where we're at, a lot of it's checkerboard, and you get the hunters fighting with the ranchers saying you can't lock up that state land and denying the access, but there's legalities where you can't corner jump or gain access to that state property in a lot of areas. And then such as the state programs, like on the pairing, they actually, the state shut down the vehicle access to a lot of those areas, part of the program. So it's through legislation, I believe we can push the state land department a little more, maybe to help allow access through those checkerboard areas if the rancher is ranching on public land. It's a juggling act. It would be have somebody educated.
I hope you're aware of the work of the Landowner Lessee Sportsmen's Committee, which endeavors
They
to do
do a
these,
lot of work with that.
to handle these issues. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Collins. You kind of touched on this a little bit on your first question, but with sportsmen's rights being under constant threat by those that do not like our way of life, what ideas do you have to educate the public, specifically to educate the public and voters for future referendums and items, and how do you fund that?
I believe through the educational ways, like I said, the social media is a very important tool. Boots on the ground with volunteers. You look how effective the trophy ban was that they tried to push. That was through, on their end, volunteers, people boots on the grounds, educating people. I wouldn't say in a ignorant way, it's more emotional way. We need to put facts in front of them. I read on your guys' website a week ago, somebody was complaining about how their money, tax money, went into helping out hunters, and they were happy with that. Game and Fish had somebody counter back and said, none of your money comes from the general fund. It comes from allocations from tags, etc. That person didn't reply back. They got an education that day. Simple things like that, talking to the public, having town halls. As a commissioner, I believe it would be important for me to go to events such as the trophy hunt gatherings and let them beat me up in a way, tell them, take their questions and try to educate them a little bit. I've had folks come into the business. We have a lot of hunters up there come in where we're at. We have the Chevron right on the junction 1864, so we're right in the middle of unit 9, 10, and 7. And I've had people actually engage hunters in my business, and I went to the person instead of running them out, I sat down for 2 hours and educated them. At the end of the day, they'd go, wow, I didn't realize that's how it is. They had no concept of hunting and conservation and what happened. So just getting out and doing town halls and publicly, getting on social media, that the costs are pretty low. It's just somebody typing on a computer. The funds for that, I believe, and that's where I'm real strong into the volunteer fire department. I believe a lot of volunteers, we're volunteers. I believe we need to try to encourage for all volunteer programs, and that's a large recruiting option. That's how I'm going to go with that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lane?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Collins, and thank you for making yourself available for the service of the state. And you actually, a planned question is something you've touched on a little bit, and that was number one on education, but also on water. And I'm wondering if you have, as part of the issues that may be related to this commission, interaction on a natural resource in our watershed area and forest management, and the workings of the Nature Conservancy, the National Forest Foundation, and others, inclusive of municipalities like Scottsdale, who have participated in efforts to try to safeguard our forests from the standpoint of just management of those forest lands. I wonder if you had some thoughts on that.
It is a trek up there where we're at with the water. You know, like I stated, our wells are 3,400 feet deep. In the springtime, we have a lot of poor winters, you're all aware of, and then lack of spring rains, and then monsoon seasons are also, you know, haven't been what they used to be. I've seen personally up there a lot of drinkers that are down, need maintenance. A lot of attention should be put towards that for the natural catchments. To purchase water up there is very expensive. It costs us 3 cents a gallon to just get out of the ground. You add a truck and cost to that, and it magnifies it. So drinkers are vital up there. I'm very familiar with the Tucson project with the reclaimed water. Municipalities, we reclaim our water at our facility for all of our landscaping. That's part of like a ranch cooperation stewardship program would benefit us with that. A lot of ranchers will shut their waters off when they go to leave. I believe we need to work with a cooperation program with them to try to maybe maintain those drinkers for them, offer some subsidies for the water, and I'd hate to put more pressure on the wildlife to do so. So there needs to be some programs, maybe grant programs or et cetera. The desert, I know they have a lot of shallower wells, a little less expensive to get the water out of the ground. But a lot of areas it's vital, and it's almost, we just got out of a lawsuit with the Havasupai over our wells. It didn't go further, but it cost us 20 grand to answer the lawsuit. And I believe it's going to get worse with that. So the water catchment systems are definitely vital up there, as all over the state. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes, in part, but as a follow-up, I'll ask, you know, specifically if you're aware of some of the efforts that the water fund efforts from the Nature Conservancy in conjunction with a number of municipalities on the rim as well as in the valley, as I might say, and also into the northern parts of the state as well, in the watershed areas. Are you familiar with those efforts? And since the water funds are on state lands, state and private lands in some consideration, that's one avenue of addressing it. The National Forest Foundation works with the federal lands in trying to address that. My focus has been on the state and private lands personally, and wondered if you had any awareness or any participation in helps in those areas, or whether you think that's an area that this commission should be at least engaged in.
I'm not aware of the program, but that is a very important program, and you know, I'd love to educate. You know, part of being a commissioner would be education into these programs such as that. But I'm not familiar with the program, but I do believe you should be engaged in that program, because water is vital. That's our wildlife supply. You know, it's 100%.
Yeah, for all of us.
Mm-hmm. For all of us.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Collins.
Morning, Mr. Collins. Thanks for taking the time to come down and talk with us this morning. The question I've got for you, there's several anti-hunting groups like the Humane Society of the United States that they've increased their efforts in recent years to eliminate the hunting and taking of predators, including bobcats and especially mountain lions. Here in Arizona, a lot of other states as well. How important do you feel it is for the commission and the department to retain their ability to manage predator populations moving forward in Arizona?
Growing up as a trapper, I've probably got at least 110 years of knowledge in my head through the people that passed down their trapping knowledge to me, as well as being a trapper since 10 years old. So I know firsthand the importance of predator control. I see the antelope population decline in the areas that we were at due to the lack of predator control. A few years ago, they had in Unit 10, they had the predator deprivation, and instantly saw positive impacts from that. Again, I believe this is an educational problem. Back in the early 90s when I was a child, I remember seeing the anti-hunting videos, anti-trapping videos of the poor dog in the trap, and people relate to the bobcats and coyotes as pets, they're pets at home. So it's definitely an emotional issue. I believe the commission, again, with the education, would be working with those groups. It's probably a solid brick wall, but it's worth an effort to go in there and try to have them sit in and show what we do, why we do it. And maybe you can get through to some of them, but like I said, most of it's a brick wall. And when you get the public support off of emotion, not education and science facts, you're gonna run into this problem. And that's, you guys ask these questions because they're tough questions. Nobody's answered them yet. We've worked on them, dabbled in them, but I believe allowing those people to get involved in a small way so we can educate them would be the best way for the commission to approach them. If you just shut them out, and they're going to keep continuing what they're doing. And I'm sure glad that program didn't pass. I've never understood how you can get onto a ballot on wildlife management issues, but that was a kind of a scary moment there. I also hunt the Navajo reservation, and they have a mountain lion problem. And you can see just over a matter of 2 years, 3 years, an area can be decimated from the lion population.
Thanks for your explanation, appreciate it.
Okay, with that, we'll start our second round of questions. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Collins, what pending or recently passed federal legislation do you think will benefit the department in carrying out their mission?
I don't know how to respond to that question. That was legislation to pass to help improve was run the corporation.
What pending or recently passed federal legislation do you think will benefit the department in carrying out their mission?
Well, funding programs like the Dingell-Johnson and the Pittman-Robertson Act that allowed funds to the Game and Fish for a lot of programs, it does help out. Legislative-wise, I'm not real familiar with the legislation with the federal government. I don't really have a response to that question.
Ms. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for Mr. Collins. I think there might be others of us who are also not totally up to date on what all the Congress might be doing, so don't worry. All right. At any rate, my question is somewhat related in the sense that we do face a constant interface issue between state management of wildlife and federal management efforts. Arizona is entrusted with the management of its wildlife, but they live on lands that at times are federally controlled, and habitat management and wildlife management are inseparable. Would you have observations on the relative roles of state and federal, and any suggestions that you might have seen arise from your experience?
This is another question I'm very familiar with. In my area, in Unit 9, is where the horse problem. And we have a lot of feral horses on the federal property, which I believe doesn't have the feral protection from the feds because we know the owners of the horses. And I've seen, with the drought conditions, they're just decimating parts of Unit 9. And I know that as the commissioners, there's not a whole lot you can do about it on federal land. I believe working with the local offices, start there and kind of work your way up to try to resolve those issues. Also the road closure issues that we've been dealing with. When it comes to the feds, a lot of them are running from Washington, D.C., not local boots on the ground in the state. And I believe the most effective ways to deal with the local aspects. That's part of when I was on the fire department, we dealt with a lot of the federal guys, and we got a lot accomplished actually having the public forums like the WEFAC, the Wildland Fire Interagency Program, and was very effective because they run their local jurisdictions. And I believe if you start with them, they might be able to be your voice, per se, through the higher ups, to try to get some programs pushed through.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Mr. Collins, thank you. As we continue to see Arizona becoming more and more urbanized, what new ideas could you bring with you that would increase participation as well as the understanding of our outdoor recreation heritage? That, as you know, our funding comes, Game and Fish funding, a lot of it's licenses and some tags, and so increasing participation is fundamental to not just revenue, but also brings people, buyership into our way of life.
Again, that's, with the urban interface is an education thing. See a lot of wildlife be attracted into urban areas due to illegal feeding of animals, not intentionally per se. And also, animals are smart. They know that's where they go for protection, is around urban areas. So I believe through, again, educational programs, such as like the Unit 7M around Flagstaff. That's a very urban hunting type area. Educating those public on how that operates. You know, you see an archery hunter walk through a half a mile down from your house going into the woods. A lot of people get irritated with that. They're not educating the subject. And it brings a negative impact into that. As far as the monies and allocations is for the public is a whole other issue. I'm seeing a lot of the tags increases. You get a family, let's say they have 5, 6 children. They're only putting themselves in, or they're putting a few in. And that's hard when that's what our budget relies on, is the sale of those items. You always want to push up so you can get more programs. So I think maybe an approach of looking at some programs that might need to be put on hold for a little bit so we can get a little more down an operating level that we need to be at. I'm not saying that there's a bad thing on there. I'm probably babbling off your question a little bit because it just, that part kind of came to mind there where I am seeing a lot of decline with people participation into programs that are caring to be into the wildlife aspect of urban areas there. They'd rather not see the people in the urban areas, and it's a lack of education, I believe, is a lot of the issues there.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lane?
Yes, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Collins. And this may be a little bit of a more difficult area to sort of maybe forecast out into. It goes on a little bit of the question of federal legislation as it relates to federal lands. And undoubtedly you're aware of the reintroduction of predators into some areas that have caused a great deal of controversy, not only here but certainly across the West, because of the extent of federal lands that are impacted and how they impact the surrounding areas. There was a suggestion not too very long ago that there might be a reassessment or a reconsideration of even the Endangered Species Act, maybe with some consideration for this and the extent of recovery of some of the predators that have been reintroduced in some areas. Do you have a thought on that and how our commission or the commission here, Game and Fish Commission, would be involved in any aspect of that?
Predators are going to be a touchy subject, especially when you have ranchers out there that believe that they're going to lose all their livestock to them. That's why they eradicated them in the first place. And part of keeping up with the North American model, we don't just focus on our game animals, we focus on all species. And I believe what you guys have set forth with if a wolf is attacking livestock, you can protect your livestock. I don't know how much more you could really revamp that program. That is a touchy subject, and there's a lot of negative towards it. And I believe, I've seen with the droughts, the hunting tags, everything that in those combinations, and add another predator in that situation was kind of a touchy subject. I don't know if it really has had an impact. That would be something I would have to educate myself on. Negative impacts of it, and maybe there hasn't been a negative impact, but they're just viewed as something people don't want. And a lot of ranchers I've talked to felt that it was almost pushed on them, and now they don't have a choice but to put up with it. And that was, I believe, through cooperation programs would have helped out with that.
Let me just follow up and say this, and that is that in some instances, the development of the population of predators has far exceeded what was set out to be, and there has not been any modification or change to the program, and in some areas. I do not have firsthand information on that here in the state of Arizona, but some enforcement of what the original guidelines were, and I suppose that's what I was thinking, if there's some thought that we could engage in that when it represents itself.
That would be more along the lines of creating a state trapping program or predator control program. If you allow the public to harvest those animals, I believe it's going to have a negative impact with the public views, especially on the animal rights activist groups that we're trying to educate and bring in into these subjects like this. If it's controlled and done through the state, through state trappers, such as other states have implemented, I believe that would be an effective tool for you guys to use.
Thank you, Mr. Collins.
Yeah, my second question for you, Mr. Collins. The use of trail cameras by sportsmen and the general public continues to be a very controversial issue. What do you believe needs to be done in the future to better control their expanding use?
This is a subject that I take personally. I live in Hollywood, I call it, Unit 9. You walk into a water hole and there's 10 cameras on it. You almost feel violated walking into the tanks. There's so many of them. In today's time where we have vehicles, we have binoculars, we got rifles that shoot 1,000 yards. There's so much technology, we're kind of losing the traditional roots of hunting. I believe there has to be some limitations on what we allow. I'm not a fan of 24-hour surveillance on all the waters in the area, and knowing where every animal is at all times. I think it takes an advantage of the animals, especially in Arizona where we don't have water. You've got one water for 10 miles. You got a camera on it, you know every animal in the area. I'm not a fan of them myself. I believe that hunting needs to stick with its traditions. We already have enough advantages over these animals. We don't need to add more of them. I'm definitely not a fan of cameras. But I also believe a lot of folks work nowadays. They don't have time to go out and scout and live in the woods, such as I'm fortunate to do on a daily basis. I'm almost in the forest. There is a give and take, and in any political model, you have to take both ends into consideration. That's where I stand on those.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, and we need to allow him time for a closing statement, but does anybody have another question they would like to ask? Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Still?
I might have another follow-up to that state and federal question that I asked earlier. We are in a constant interface with federal regulations and state efforts to manage wildlife. And part of what I was aiming at in my question is Arizona is full of federal designations of conservation areas, wilderness study areas, parks, and every other designation you could possibly think of, all of which have different management requirements and regulations, and that includes border areas where Game and Fish has historically had to put little notices in, like I live in 36B, okay, right on the border with Mexico. And they have to put little notices that say, warning, contraband and illegal smuggling and armed persons may be encountered here. these are interfaces with federal, federal role and, or perhaps the lack of effort on the federal part or limited effectiveness of the feds and the state effort to manage wildlife, because hunters are disincentivized to go to places where either it's a probability of fires because of lack of wildland management, probability of interface with illegal activities, other circumstances that make it quite difficult. Would you have observations on this subject beyond what you said earlier?
I do. I've never personally hunted the desert because of I didn't want to have to put up with that. I go out in the woods to enjoy myself, not look over my shoulder. And I believe that is a huge revenue loss for the Arizona Game and Fish Department with the southern areas there. I've seen in other states, Nevada is an example, I've seen they have units that they set aside for growing a population to be retransplanted into different areas. I thought that was a unique approach to certain areas. So the desert area, you could almost look at it as a stalking area. Because I don't think, I personally know somebody that got an engagement with the drug dealers down there and had to shoot somebody. And I would never hunt the desert areas there. So I believe approach, you know, it's kind of out of the box approach, but almost use it as kind of a stalking area. As far as the federal cooperation programs with access, I believe that's where you have to outreach to the local jurisdictions of those programs, the local forestry offices, the national monument folks, and try to start with them to get a little more involvement of the Arizona Game and Fish Commission so you can get your voice into there. But that's going to be a lifetime battle, going with back and forth with the feds versus states.
Thank you.
Another quick follow-up question, anybody? Okay. Would you like to give your closing statement?
Yes. My passion for hunting and the outdoors has a huge impact on my life, and it would be an honor to work with the Arizona Game and Fish community to further my appreciation and education for conservation and improvement of our wildlife for my kids' generations and generations to come. Close enough.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for coming.
We have about 5 or 6 minutes if anybody needs to go get a drink or something.